Joy's Way, a map for the transformational journey. Chapter 9, Departure from Orthodox Medicine, Disease and Death as Transformations, the Transformational Therapist. And then there's a quote here, and it says, "A problem can never be resolved at the level of the problem, nor a paradox at the level of the paradox. One must rise above the level of the problem, or the paradox, to find a resolution." I would like to share with you a set of experiences that together formed a pivot in my life. The set contains the final link that allowed my awareness to comprehend a series of dynamics that, in turn, culminated in the sweeping changes in my life in mid-1974. I've already told you that I had known at 17 that I would not be practicing conventional medicine after the age of 34. The knowledge seemed paradoxical to me. I so thoroughly enjoyed the practice of medicine that I could not imagine any other equally satisfying mode of expressing my beingness. As it turned out, the event that precipitated the changes did not care about my personal desires or my immediate satisfactions. It was concerned with much deeper commitments. On January 27, 1974, I turned 35. If you're interested in astrology, my birthplace was Salt Lake City, Utah. And the hour was 3 p.m. On that day, I expected some big dramatic change. But my morning meditation was nothing special. No beam of golden light split the heavens to illuminate my consciousness, and my birthday celebration with my twin brother, his wife, my parents, at a Mexican restaurant in Costa Mesa, California, was quiet and undramatic. The only high was induced by a giant margarita. By the end of the day, however, I had completely rationalized away the intuitive knowledge that I had had for so many years. After all, my life had changed considerably since I had met Eunice, and after her death, the inner teacher, I had conceived command therapy and I was using it in my practice. My exploration of the energy fields of the body was developing rapidly. I was instructing some interested patients and a few physicians in body energy fields. And in my home each week, I met with a group of 10 or 12 people to probe more deeply into the dream states and the images that can arise in awareness during group meditation. Perhaps I am already fulfilling the prophecy in some such way that I do not need to leave orthodox medicine, I thought. The idea eased my mind. I was on my way up in the administrative echelons of the hospital staff. I had had an 18-month experience as co-director of medical education on the hospital administrative staff. My working relationships were, in general, excellent. I suspected and hoped that I would be able to influence conventional medicine the easy way, from the inside. That evening, in short, I thought that I was going to accomplish my revealed work without having to give anything up. I decided to live in the best of two worlds. My bliss was the bliss of ignorance. A more fundamental portion of my consciousness had other plans. In this framework, I was to learn the consequences of my own immaturity and of my attachment to the ideas that I had constructed about my life. Several months before my 35th birthday, I had begun to feel a pattern of abdominal pains. They were episodic and initially appeared at intervals of about 6 weeks. The sensation in the upper abdomen was a sudden, intense cramping that then radiated to the back. Associated with it were nausea, sweating, lightheadedness, and weakness. The intensity took only minutes to develop, then remained at the same level for 12 to 24 hours. A stoic type, I refused to allow my body to interfere with my commitments, whether to patients or to ideals. Each day of pain, I would finish my professional work, return home, turn the electric blanket to its highest setting, and try to sleep. By morning, the pain was usually beginning to wane, and after several days, I would feel fine, as if the attack had never taken place. I told my wife that I had much greater sympathy for women with menstrual cramping because my first 3 attacks were exactly on schedule. But by February, shortly after my 35th birthday, the attacks were coming more frequently, about 3 weeks apart. Being a diagnostician, I had already surmised that the disease process involved either the pancreas or the small bowel, or both. By late March, 2 months after my 35th birthday, the attacks were coming every 2 weeks, and I put myself and my disease into the hands of a specialist in gastrointestinal disorders. After x-rays, blood and urine studies, and a direct inside view of my stomach and duodenum by means of fiber optics, he concluded that I was suffering from chronic relapsing pancreatitis. Since all the treatable causes of the disease had been eliminated from our consideration, that there was no cure in my case. From my medical training, I knew that the disease is unpredictable, since it sometimes ends abruptly for an indefinite period of time. Each attack can be the last. On the other extreme, each attack can turn it into fulminating pancreatitis. Fulminating pancreatitis, the mortality of which is about 80%. In its most common course, it leads progressively to pancreatic insufficiency and myriad associated problems. I tried a deep psychological probe of myself. Why was I manifesting a disease process that could severely restrict my activities or take me out of this plane altogether? The inner teacher offered no answer, not even a hint. With each attack, I explored the circumstances that surrounded it, trying to find some pattern. I found none. I examined the stresses of my life, but they were inconsequential in comparison to the disease process, and thus not powerful enough to lead to it. I talked to my body, trying to find some symbolic aspect that a malfunctioning pancreas might reflect, but nothing appeared. I simply could not see the dynamics of my problem. In July 1974 in Los Angeles, I gave my first public lecture. It was for the annual conference at the Center for the Healing Arts, and its title was Metaphysics, Meditation, and Medicine. In it, I shared my experience of dramatic healings in my own work by giving people options to chronic or terminal diseases. By then, 5 months after my birthday, I was having attacks every 3 days. I could share my experiences in my patients' cures, but I seemed completely unable to do anything for myself. The months of July and August kept me very busy. With one or another of my partners vacationing, my workload was more than doubled. Now my morning meditation was at 4 a.m., and I arrived at the hospital by 5:30 to begin rounds, and sometimes visited as many as 35 patients before 9:30. When I began to see scheduled patients in my office. If there were no emergencies, the workday went on till 10 or 11 p.m. I loved it. Then came the 30 minutes that were there to alter my entire life. Then came the 30 minutes that were to alter my entire life. It was a Saturday morning. I had finished rounds at the hospital and was working on some patient's charts in my office when I felt an incredibly strong urge to enter into meditation. It was so strong that I did not understand what was happening to me. I completed the patient's charts and gave in to the impress. A vortex of energy of a magnitude I had never before experienced reverberated through my body and through my awareness into a super heightened state. Then a loud voice, not that of my inner teacher, said in essence, "Your experience and training as an orthodox physician is completed. It's over. The time has come for you to embark on a rededication of your beingness to a deeper commitment and action." Automatically, my yes, but tape came up. Oh, I see. Automatically, my yes, but tape came on. Yes, but can't you see that I'm committed to my patients, to my partners, to insurance agents, and to the banks, to the IRS, to... The voice didn't care to hear about my many personal concerns and commitments. It next presented to my awareness that I would begin a journey into the world, going first to Findhorn and to England, Egypt, India, Nepal, near the Tibetan border, and perhaps to Japan. The journey was to reawaken old soul memories. They, in turn, would bring to my awareness knowledge not then available to my outer mind. The voice explained clearly that my vision of being a physician had been distorted by boyhood ideals and by the current concepts of science and medicine, which overemphasized the body and external causes and ignored the journey of the soul. I was to begin the study of alternate healing practices and reach insights Western medicine had not yet dared to dream, insights that would unify exoteric and esoteric traditions and thus form a basis of an integrated approach to the art of healing. The last instruction the voice gave me was simply to detach from everything. The experience sounds messianic, and it was. In fact, the meditation is as vivid in my mind today as the day it occurred more than 4 years ago. When one begins to touch upon a collective force greater than one's personal power, the experience is awesome. If the ego or personal level of consciousness claims the more expanded levels as its own, the consequent inflation of ego may be devastating to the self later when the expanded levels are in some way withdrawn or unavailable. I also realize that the collective areas of awareness influence many different people about the same time. I had a choice of responding to the collective impress or remaining within the confines of my own personal ego structure. There are many other people whose study of alternate healing practices will lead to insights Western medicine has not seen. They too will have an opportunity to integrate exoteric and esoteric traditions. Like seeds scattered upon the earth, some will come to fruition and many will not. In my case, the choice was, and still is, whether to participate in a more universal pattern of life or to remain within personal systems of thought and action. Fortunately, my ego structure is able to allow expanded impresses to function through me without confusing the collective and the individual selves. I knew that the voice had spoken deep truths. I saw the reawakened vision. Everything I had established materially, financial security, possessions, professional reputation, social status, even family and friends, was to be left behind. For exactly what? I did not know. But I did know. By the time the meditation was over, I felt a connection to the deepest part of my beingness. I was entrusting the course of my life to a higher orchestrator. By the end of those 30 minutes, I had surrendered. On coming out of that meditation, I dictated my resignation from my partnership and letters requesting leaves of absence from the hospital staff and my academic teaching positions. Called a realtor to put the house up for sale and asked a friend to sell the cars. Wendy was traveling at the time. When I finally reached her, she was excited by my meditation experience, but was not entirely convinced that I would really carry out such a vast change in my life. In 6 weeks, everything was gone. Practice, teaching positions, home, cars, most of the furnishings and clothes. Before meditation, I'd never heard of Findhorn, but soon I learned that it was a spiritual community in northern Scotland. If a vortex that swept over me like the tornado had carried Dorothy and Toto to the land of Oz, my yellow brick road began at Findhorn. If you cannot accept the idea of the voice because you do not understand it, I fully sympathize with you. You will find it even more difficult to believe that the voice spoke to me of Findhorn, of which I had never heard. I do not understand the voice either, and I cannot explain in any brief, easily comprehensive terms, in terminology accessible to the rational outer mind, how the voice could talk about things that I had never heard of. But I accept both the voice and what the voice said. And of course I have further advantage. I know it happened. In the 6 weeks before leaving for Europe, I lived in 2 simultaneous feeling states: pain and exhilaration. My pain was associated with detaching myself from loved ones' patients, a home that inspired me every time I returned to it, a stimulating lifestyle, and the security that surrounded it all. On the other hand, the exhilaration of leaping into the unknown was intoxicating. My future no longer offered a single set of probabilities, as predictable as the social, cultural, and material artifacts from which they stemmed. My life was now filled with a great number of sets of possibilities, infinitely varied. I felt a new sense of vitality rising from the roots of my being. The wellspring that nourished my awareness was the knowing, the absolute knowing that the course of action I was following was true to my soul. The jump off the cliff into what appeared to be oblivion simply didn't matter. I barely remember the 6 to 8 weeks before I arrived in Scotland. My outer mind was dazzled. It was not until the second day there, while I was walking along the North Sea coast, that I suddenly woke up to reality. I had not had a single abdominal pain attack since the morning of the meditation. Of course, no other words were possible because the insight was clear. The intensity of energy that reverberated through my body during the transformational meditation healed the chronic, relapsing pancreatitis totally, completely, and instantly. My disease had been the signal of a major force within me that was demanding change. There had been a choice to follow, either my outer mind or my soul. I had chosen my soul's path, and my soul was free to flow. Until the time of the great meditation, my outer mind had completely rationalized its position on conventional medicine, in fact, on everything about my life. But the inner pattern and path had been there all the time. I just hadn't wanted to look at them, and my refusal to look at them had been part of the cause of the disease. I had already learned much in my work with cancer patients. If a disease is on a terminating or downhill course, a transformational process is manifesting. The obvious transformation forward, which that patient is heading, is physical death. But there may also be a transformation on this side, in the living. If that transformation is chosen, and if it is to be effective, the change in the patient's attitudes and life pattern must be as complete as would transpire through death. Halfway means you won't do it. There is no room for compromise. Sweeping changes are required, and each individual knows what those changes must be. Marshalling the courage and the clarity to make the necessary changes is a real challenge. The vaster area of our beingness does not know what death or disease is. Not that this vaster area is simply ignorant, quite the contrary. It is the outer fragmented aspects of our beingness that are ignorant. They do not realize the consequences of focusing our awareness on conditioned ideas about life and values. When change is called for, often by a disease process or some other serious disruption in one's life, we have a choice. We can take the direct action that will harmonize our beingness, or we can block ourselves from that direct action and let our outer minds pretend that we don't understand. Our disease, or our psychological knot, is doing for us what we couldn't or wouldn't do directly and with awareness. When our outer mind cannot or will not manifest the essence of our desire, the unconscious mechanism does it for us. Without our understanding it or willingness, the unconscious mechanism finds a pathway out of the mode from which the psyche desires release. The path it finds may not be to the liking of the outer mind, such as death, but it is nevertheless, like death, an effective way out. If the action of the mind obstructs the soul from fulfilling its fundamental life commitments, then mental diseases, emotional disorders, and diseases of the body ensue. On the other hand, transformation brings about resolution. One way or another, through cure or through death, it resolves the symptoms and the disease. This personal transformational process is the foundation of all my work, both with individual clients and with conference participants. The principles involved in the unblocking of the soul's flow can be applied universally. In this widespread sense, they are the basis of the psychophysical, spiritual, therapeutic interaction called transformational psychology. The word psychology, literally interpreted, is a study of the soul, even though current usage restricts it almost entirely to the outer mind. Transformational psychology is nothing less than the study of the transformation of the soul, the freeing of the soul into natural expression. Its fundamental focus in the treatment of the human being is the mind that has somehow walked into a closet, closed the door, turned out the light, and instantly forgotten about all these events. Most conventional therapeutic approaches to the mind now recognize that mind-body relationship, but hardly any of them accept experientially the mind-body-soul integrity. A mind cut from the very source of its essence, the soul, is like a body cut off from its brain. Let me read that sentence again. A mind cut off from its very soul. No, a mind cut off from the very source of its essence, the soul, is like a body cut off from its brain. In coma, or when the portions of the brain are destroyed through anoxia, trauma, or destructive disease processes, the body still functions to a very limited degree and can be viable for long periods of time, but it is never anywhere near complete functioning. In a similar way, the mind, cut off from the soul, is viable, can function in very limited degrees. Clearly, the soul that animates the body is analogous to the mind that animates the body. No. Clearly, the soul that animates the mind is analogous to the mind that animates the body. When all three are in conjunction, the transformational process of the human being is greatly accelerated. From the metaphysical perspective, a person's body is essentially perfect for that individual in any particular lifetime. There may be certain built-in restrictions that act to limit a particular person's physical or mental actions, but no matter how the outer mind conceives of them, these restrictions are always for the betterment of the individual. Once the individual accepts the limitation and turns to the development of other resources, the limitation has served its purpose and is no longer necessary in this or later lifetimes. The individual is enriched through the limitation. In any individual, the soul is always the most advanced aspect. At a developmental stage, far, far beyond the awareness of the outer mind or the body. In an individual, the soul is always the most advanced aspect. At a developmental stage, far, far beyond the awareness of the outer mind or the body. It is the outer mind, with its memories, that causes the difficulties. The outer awareness often ignores the covenant with the body. It goes off in its constructs of reality and treats the body as no more than an object, but the mind's constructs are developed by way of highly filtered perceptions, and it is the mind, not the body, that blocks spiritual awareness. The body and the spirit need no education. It is the outer mind in relationship to the soul that is undergoing the training and the experiences in this dimension. The mind which ought to be the liaison between the physical and the spiritual, is the only aspect of the human being that has to be integrated. Of the three, the mind is the only portion that can be confused. There are no such things as spiritual confusion or body confusion, only mind confusion. Once the mind capitulates to the higher essence, psychological diseases, confusion, and most diseases caused by the mind's interaction with the body simply disappear. The soul is an individuation out of spirit. The mind, as we unconventionally conceive it, is here and essentially a byproduct, an observer, that is, until it tries to usurp the place of the soul and the body, and then it creates a pandemonium. From the spiritual perspective, the mind must be continually reminded that the body is an energy configuration of the soul-spirit interaction, with the mind as a witness. Mind, in the usual sense of the word, does not create the body, though it would often like to think that it does, nor does the mind create the soul, as it very often thinks it does. The mind is not and cannot be dominant in the mind-body-soul triad. It is the mind's attempt to be dominant that causes most of our problems in this plane. Transformational psychology is a tool to integrate the three parts of the triad, recognizing that the patient's mind, with its memory bank of experiences, both in this lifetime and in many prior lifetimes, is what makes all the mistakes. Transformational psychology places direct responsibility for physical and psychological disease directly upon the patient, specifically upon the patient's mind. The true reality of the soul and body relationship, from which the mind is only a byproduct, is literally mind-boggling. It is simply incomprehensible and intolerable to the intellect until the mind can accept this status and reposition itself to become the soul's witness on the physical plane. Pain and suffering remain. Once the mind accepts that the soul's consciousness and awareness transcend the consciousness and awareness of the mind itself, there is freedom. One no longer needs to remain within the confines of the outer mind. Transformational psychology recognizes three stages in any transformational process. First is the awakening to the realization that most of the experiences of life perceived as external to oneself are actually projections of the self onto reality. The second stage emphasizes the owning of these projections, pulling them back into the individual's mind and integrating them with the concept of self. This stage is a critical one. In it, one must learn the dynamics of any problem are clearly under one's own power and control and therefore changeable, or in a term of transformational psychology, transmutable. This second stage is completed when it is really out there. This second stage is completed when what is really out there can be perceived without distortion. In the final transformational process, one knows that there is no separation between what is experienced as external and what is experienced as internal. They are the same thing. There is no external or internal reality to distinguish. The Tibetan Buddhist approach to the resolution of problems delineates three pathways. The highest and most difficult is to transmute the problem. That is, to generate an intensity of energy from a higher, more expanded awareness and to use this energy to force a change in the configuration of the problem's less expanded, less intense energy, and thus to free the energy that configurates the problem. Transmutation implies a change in the form or nature of anything into another form or nature. In this plane, all energy flows from more energetic sources to less energetic manifestations, never in the opposite direction. Therefore, high aspects of consciousness always transmute lower aspects of consciousness. The second Tibetan Buddhist path is to ennoble the problem, to treat it as a necessary and important stepping stone of experience in one's unfolding. In the West, this process is called rationalization, and it has a negative connotation rather than the positive insight that has come from the Buddhist viewpoint. The third Tibetan Buddhism pathway is to go directly into the problem and allow it to manifest completely. There is but one injunction one must make the There is but one injunction. One must make a portion of one's awareness into a witness that observes the problem. In this way, understanding may come. This last method is considered to be the path of subtle wisdom. And for many people, it is a more appropriate pathway than that of direct transmutation. In practice, most of us use various combinations of the three pathways in dealing with our personal problems. Vitvan, Vitvan, a Western mystic, taught that there were two ways of dealing with problems. One was to transmute the problem, and the second was to wear it out. Sometimes it seems that most of us are stuck with the latter method. Transformational psychology does not try to make any individual normal. Instead, its approach is based on the realization that in this lifetime, each individual is working out certain aspects of development on a far vaster scale than that of most psychotherapeutic modalities. For example, one individual may be developing deeper resources in the mental area with less emphasis on the sexual and emotional areas, while another individual may be working on the development of emotional expression and not the mental or sexual. I consider it absurd to believe that every soul is to be integrated into a normal, healthy pattern. No two human beings are working on exactly the same developments at the same time. Until the therapist's consciousness can embrace the continuity of life, can accept Until the therapist's consciousness can embrace the continuity of life, or even worse, toward a self-centered commonality. I'm going to start the sentence over again. Okay. Until the therapist's consciousness can embrace the continuity of life, can accept that the soul of the individual is in a developmental process requiring many dimensions of experience, most psychotherapeutic work, misunderstanding the life process, becomes awkward, coercive, toward uninspired uniformity, or even worse, toward a self-centered commonality. Wow, that's a pretty deep sentence, so I'm going to read that one more time, just so we can really get it here. Okay. Until the therapist's consciousness can embrace the continuity of life, can accept that the soul of the individual is a developmental process requiring many dimensions of experience, most therapeutic work, misunderstanding the life process, becomes an awkward coercion toward uninspired uniformity, or even worse, toward self-centered commonality. Why must we continually learn about our immortality through the process called death? When are we going to awaken into our immortality while living? When are we going to give up the concept of the innocent victim? When will we realize that disease is simply doing for us what we ourselves refuse to do? Why must we generate the energy of crisis to approach the spiritual? Transformational psychology shifts the perspective of the outer mind towards these questions. I wish to state honestly that the development of transformational psychology as a therapeutic approach is only in its beginning stages. It is not a polished product, nor is it by any means complete. The premises, though not experimentally proved, are experimentally sound. Finally, there are at most 10 or 12 people who are practicing this or a similar form of therapy. The transformational therapist, already in the process of working through the filters of his or her own mind, is at a stage of not only seeing clearly the outer mind of the client, but also entering telepathically into a rapport with the client's soul, and thus gaining insight into the particular dynamics that that soul is expressing. Thus, the transformational therapist is in contact with the flow not only of his or her own soul, but of the patient's soul as well. This particular development of the therapist comes through the meditative process, through working with a teacher, or through both. The transformational therapist has developed the ability to heighten his or her own consciousness at will. The heart chakra center, and usually the throat chakra, the forehead center, and the crown center are functioning in a more refined state than in the ordinary states of awareness. And again, this control over the chakras of the therapist is achieved through a meditative process with the help of the heightening influence of the teacher. The transformational therapist realizes that the client is a mirror to the therapist's own consciousness, and that the therapist is a mirror for the client as well. The therapist tries not to forget that the dynamics of the client is working through have equivalent counterparts in his or her own consciousness. The therapist working with the client's dynamics is working with identical dynamics in himself or herself at the same time, as is implicit from our earlier discussions of the hologram. The transformational therapist is capable of a sense of consciousness in which he or she knows the totality of his or her own beingness contains the beingness of the client, without the clients having to express it in any way, physically, emotionally, or verbally. The therapist's consciousness contains everything there is to know about the client. The therapist is aware, too, that in the same way, the client has the potential of knowing all the therapist represents and senses. Initially, the transformational therapist may use such clues as voice vibration, body language, and the emotional responses of the client to help guide his or her personal consciousness to the area that reflects the client. At a later stage of the therapist's development, these clues are no longer necessary. The therapist experiences the client directly. Realizing that the specific problem of the client is only the shadow of a much deeper pattern dynamic, the transformational therapist does not start at the problem level, the level at which the client perceives the difficulty. Instead, the transformational therapist tries to comprehend the pattern level of consciousness which is manifesting the problem, and to focus the transmutational energy there. Nothing of much value, perhaps nothing of any value, will happen if the client's awareness is allowed to remain in the perspective of the problem. Clients are so conditioned to play their tragedy records, repeat their problems over and over again, not only to therapists, but to almost anyone who will listen, and that if they stay on the problem level, they are most certain to continue to play the same song over and over, forever in an endless groove. The first task of the transformational therapist, then, is to heighten the client's awareness into a state of clarity. This opening process can be accomplished by several techniques. One way is to simply ignore the problem. The more the client attempts to amplify it, the more the therapist is to ignore the amplification and to avoid avoid interaction with it. The client may rant and cry, scream, cry out, and all of it is to be ignored. If a quiet meditation with the client doesn't work, the therapist may resort to getting the client to dance, to go swimming with the client, to telling an outrageous joke inducing laughter, to taking a walk with the client, to doing Tai Chi, to singing or to chanting with the client. Anything to shift the perspective of the client away from the problem level of the outer mind. The actual heightening of the client's awareness comes about through an induction process. The therapist's level of consciousness, as reflected through his or her body fields, induces a similar field of consciousness in the client's energy field, and the client's consciousness shifts concomitantly to form an appropriate fit to the new energy field. Induction is the process by which the body, having electrical or magnetic properties, produces magnetism, an electric charge, or an electromotive force in the neighboring body without contact. Until the client releases the perspective from the problem level, therapeutic interaction is not possible. Energy field induction through the heart chakra, manifesting a state of unconditional love, lifts the client up out of the level of the outer mind, is configuring as the problem into a state of clarity. If the transformational therapist is in a state of unconditional love, and if induction occurs, the client cannot stay at the problem level. The transformational therapist may have to work directly with the client's chakras. In this technique, energy is transferred through the therapist's hands to induce the shift in the client's awareness. This part of the work will be discussed in the chapter on techniques. Once the client is in a heightened state of consciousness, the transformational therapist induces the witness state. In it, the client can see the problem level without reacting to it, either mentally or emotionally. When all the options are seen simultaneously, the client's evaluation will shift automatically to the pattern level, since the options seen in the heightened state of consciousness may be overwhelming when the client's emotional and mental levels are registered later. The therapist must carefully prepare the client for this possibility. If the client accepts the options and the new value system envisioned in the heightened state of awareness, the problem or disease configuration will alter in direct relationship to the client's commitment to a new course of action and to his or her ability to sustain that action. The therapist can assume no responsibility for it. The commitment and the sustaining of that commitment are entirely the responsibility of the client. While the therapist and the client are together in the heightened state of awareness, the therapist brings out as much of the totality of the client's beingness as the client is capable of experiencing, instead of continuing on with what he or she thinks is his or her purpose and intention in this lifetime. The client must learn to perceive the intention of his or her soul work. This area is where transformational psychology becomes an art, and where the therapist must not be a scientist or a metaphysician, This is where the transformational psychology becomes an art, and where the therapist must not be a scientist or metaphysician, not an advisor or counselor, but an artist. When it is necessary, the transformational therapist is able to help the dying client through physical death. The choice is always the client's. Transformation on through death is one and the same thing as the transformational process in life. As you may realize, it is only the prejudiced, conditioned outer mind that sees the transformation as different from the other. The transformational therapist teaches the client to be able to induce the heightened state of awareness for himself or herself. The techniques include the use of a piece of music that is conditioned to the therapeutic interaction. This method will be discussed in depth in the next chapter. Practice of the spiral meditation technique and the playing of a tape recorder of the therapeutic session. These techniques, whether in combination or alone, tend to place the client's consciousness in a level similar to that of the session. It is impossible to overemphasize the value of tape recordings of therapeutic sessions. It is impossible to overemphasize the value of tape recordings of therapeutic sessions. Because of the phenomena of state-bound consciousness, the client cannot remember, even for a few hours, what the critical areas of resolution were. This forgetting does not occur only in transformational experiences, but is in general common in any kind of psychotherapeutic exchange, though one rarely hears of people recording their sessions with their analysts. I feel strongly that they should insist on doing so. I am sure that many problems would be resolved much more quickly. During the course of the interaction, the transformational therapist can work with any significant dream material that the client may offer. The purpose is not to interpret the dream, but to teach the client the relationship of the inner dream to the outer reality, because this relationship always reveals the pattern level of consciousness. Toward the close of the initial therapeutic interaction, the therapist reminds the client that the client's awareness may be repolarized back into the problem perspective. The experienced transformational therapist may even choose to demonstrate this possibility by deliberately inducing the problem level and then inducing the resolution level, so that the client can experience the dramatic shift in awareness and feeling states that the repolarization process engenders. At the close of the session, the transformational therapist impresses on the client the beauty and magnificence of the life process and the opening up of opportunities for personal development presented by the problem. The client, inspired and uplifted, senses that he or she is beginning to manifest the highest potential available. I oppose the usual habitual practices of an hour interaction and of daily or weekly meetings. A minimum of 3 hours or even an entire day may be necessary to work fully into and out of a transformational experience. The therapist also discourages the dependence of the client by seeing the client infrequently, perhaps at 6-week intervals or monthly at most. Last, the transformational therapist knows when to do absolutely nothing for a client, probably the most difficult aspect to master in a do something, do anything society. What is most to be deplored is any technique or any medication that allows the patient to simply cope with life. Nobody wants to just cope, everybody wants more. When the client is precipitated into heightened states of resolution, the symptoms of anxiety, depression, and fear dissolve, while tranquilizers and other therapeutic drugs only mask the symptoms that have been functioning as signals to tell the outer mind that change is necessary. The transformation of the client's value system is real therapy. It is change. The frequent or habitual use of mind-expanding drugs by either the therapist or the client also works against the psychotherapeutic interaction. Okay, I'm going to read that sentence again because especially in our society, that seems like a powerful and necessary statement. The frequent or habitual use of mind-expanding drugs by either the therapist or the client also works against the psychotherapeutic interaction. Although the drug experience can be a breakthrough for an individual, continued use of psychedelics, hallucinogenics, or other drugs eventually blocks the ability in either the therapist or the client to achieve natural expanded states of awareness. From personal exploration with hallucinogens, I know that the drug experience is less satisfactory and less productive than naturally induced higher states of awareness. In exploring transformational psychology in conferences at Sky High Ranch, I have found that the heightening process and the development of overview are accelerated by the group experience. The energy field of a group is far more intense than that of a transformational therapist alone. Control of the group field is vital to success, however, because if the group is precipitated into negative or contracted states, the therapist must use every resource of his or her beingness to recenter the group. The most crucial factor in the use of transformational psychology is the level of development of the therapist. No matter how thoroughly trained his or her outer mind may be, it must never direct the psychotherapeutic interaction. However highly developed, it is still the outer mind too limited to be allowed control. It is not to be the dominant orchestrator, but at best a useful and important tool. Not all clients are able to allow the induction into higher states of awareness. We must keep that in mind. While the outer mind is not the source of the problem, it invariably compounds the problem. Since the problem level always serves the clients in secondary ways, they may be unwilling or unable to relinquish their attachment to it. As a rule, I find that if a client, after the therapeutic session, repolarizes the problem quickly, he or she is hanging on to the problem with great intensity. If the problem is to be repolarized slowly, the client is on the way to being able to let go of the problem. In the psychotherapeutic interaction, it is usually desirable that the client be sufficiently intelligent to comprehend what is happening during the session, but intelligence is certainly not essential. When the mind is capable of understanding the process, the induction from the therapist's energy fields to the client's fields often brings comprehension by itself. The client may not know what has happened, but he or she will certainly be aware that something has happened. Psychoses are not beyond the reach of transformational psychology, but their treatment requires a very high level of development on the part of the therapist. The therapist must not only transmute his or her own fear of psychosis, but must also understand the psychotic process, because psychosis is not necessarily an abnormal state. Violent clients can be treated, but only by a therapist whose energy fields are intense. Obviously, extreme cases require incarceration, hospitalization, or both until the crisis subsides. During the crisis, however, the transformational therapist can still continue with induction work, sometimes with dramatic effect. The therapist must realize that when a client is on a self-destructive course, the therapeutic approach may be not to interfere with it. always, what determines the proper therapeutic procedure is not the desires of society or of an individual therapist's outer conditioned mind or of the expecting part of the client's mind. The key is the flow of the soul. The therapist's task is to determine where the soul is going and then to help clear away the blocks to its getting there. In our age of transition, we shall witness the blending of the medical, the scientific, and the psycho-spiritual approaches in the healing spectrum available to all human beings. We are already on the way.